Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us here on the Sport Trade stage for our expert panel discussion, Women's Sport Revolution inside the World Cup. I'm delighted today to be joined by a very illustrious panel of truly experts on a global level on this subject. To recap, we have Barbara Slater, Director of Sport at the BBC, Megan Klingberg, World Cup winner and co-founder of Reinc, and we've got Jenny Wang, who's entrepreneur, investor, and also co-founder of Reinc. So the purpose of today's talk really is to talk all things women's football, but specifically around the successes of the Women's World Cup. And I think nobody can deny that it really was an unprecedented success, and it's helped to change the profile of women's football, and it's also raised many of the issues around equality. And to give you some context, I've got a few facts and figures, which I'm just going to quickly run through before we get started. So of the many positives from the World Cup, professional players being the first one, I think one of the figures I have here is that in Europe, the number of semi-professional and professional female footballers has over doubled between 2013 and 2017. In terms of viewership, FIFA estimated that the 2019 Women's World Cup, it drew in over a billion viewers worldwide. Wow. In terms of sponsorship, there's been some real progress. I note that Visa, one of the 6 global sponsors of FIFA, pledged to spend the same amount on marketing of the Women's World Cup as they did the Men's World Cup. And finally, in terms of advertising, huge increases in the USA alone. There was over $100 million spent on television advertising in around the Women's World Cup. So a lot of good things happening and a lot of progress. But also, I think a lot of issues have come to light, some of them old and some of them new. And I guess 2 of the big ones that spring to the top of my mind is in around pay and in around prize money. And again, I have 1 or 2 facts or figures on that. The average salary for a female professional footballer around the world is $7,000. In the UK and the WSL, it averages 27,000, which is exactly or slightly over 1/100th of what a male player makes in the Premier League. And also, in terms of prize money, it was well documented that the prize money was increased from 15 to 30 million, which is a great thing, but it's still a fraction of the 400 million that the men get in the World Cup. So clearly, there are still some major issues to discuss, and that's what we're here today to do. So I'm going to jump straight into it. Barbara, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay.
Thank you.
Just how well did the Women's World Cup perform on the BBC, and what have you guys got plans to help further promote women's football in the future?
Indeed, it was a phenomenal success. And I mean, we've been investing in women's football, upping the amount of coverage for a number of years. And certainly we did a step change when the World Cup was in Canada, showing every match live on the BBC. But I think we saw this summer a perfect storm. We have a sport here that is on the rise. There is a momentum behind women's football that is fantastic, and I know we'll touch on this later, but we should not deny that. So the BBC invested a marketing campaign and a whole campaign around Change the Game, which is all about the promotion of women's sport, and put the weight behind it that we would a Men's World Cup, and even a bit more, because I think we felt there was a story to tell. The scale of a Christmas campaign on the BBC backed the Women's World Cup, and the highest audience in the UK ever for a women's football match was just over 4 million. The opening match, and that was for the European Championships, just 2 years before, the audience figures for the opening match were over 6, setting an all-time record. By the time England were in the semi-final against the USA, that peak audience had got to 11.7 million people. Now,
and sorry, I'd love to jump in real quick. And what's really cool and interesting about women's football is that men's football seems to be tapped out. I mean, there's players that are being transferred for $220 million from team to team. But that doesn't happen in the women's game. So it's at a level where if you invest 10, 20, 50 years down the road, hopefully there can be lots of money to be made.
Yeah. Some of the successes that we've talked about from the World Cup and some of the challenges that also we've briefly touched upon, do you think there's parallels between those successes and challenges that women are facing on the pitch and those that women are facing in the business place?
Definitely. So as Meg mentioned, I mean, she was one of the leaders in the lawsuit for equal pay earlier this year, where the U.S. women's national soccer team sued for fair wages, etc. And so that was kind of the thesis for the new company that we're starting. It's a startup called Re-Inc. But basically what we are is, instead of trying to fight for a greater slice of the pie, like with the lawsuit, we thought, why don't we just create a new pie? And the best way to create a new pie is through equity. When you own your own company, you call the shots. You get 100% of the revenue that comes to you. You get to dictate how you run the business and the type of impact that you have on the world. And so what our company is all about is about resisting the status quo, reinventing what the future looks like. We are a direct-to-consumer, purposeful lifestyle brand, starting out in streetwear, completely designed by Megan and the other 3 players on our team, Megan Rapinoe, Kristen Press, and Tobin Heath. We think that, you know, if we really want to change the world, we have to start from equity. And as young startups have more female ownership, when they grow into bigger companies, the next IPOs or whatever, that really can change the gap on the cap table, so to speak. And so that's hopefully the impact that we are trying to have. Yeah.
So just staying on that subject then, in terms, you know, we mentioned some of the inequalities in pay that we're seeing in football. Is that the case for all sports, or is there other sports that we can look to where there's more equality? And which sports should we be looking to?
Well, I think there are some fantastic examples. Let's look at tennis, where actually we've had for decades at the Grand Slam tournaments, men and women, and I know there's big battles there in the past for equal prize money. If you look across a whole range of Olympic sports, my own sport was gymnastics. Yeah. It's been really interesting coming into the world of work from that background, because there was always equality in gymnastics, and it came as a surprise to me that actually that wasn't necessarily the wider world. And you know, it's interesting, you talk about kind of parity and however many average fee of $7,000. As an Olympic gymnast, I can assure you there were no dollars. Yes, got ticket paid to go to the Olympics and maybe a leotard, but that was about it. So it's a journey, a different journey for different sports. But I would feel incredible optimism about women's football, because I think it's a global game. I think the standard of play, and it's interesting we talk about the word equal. It's a game in its own right. It will have its differences, and that's fantastic. And I don't think that's a problem.
We have to find the beauty in the differences.
Correct.
Why can't different be the beauty?
I couldn't agree more. Yeah. To win Women's World Cup is an ultimate prize.
So just talking about diversity, given some of the issues in football over the past couple of weeks, you know, there's been a lot of talk about the Women's World Cup promoting diversity. Is there things that we can learn, lessons that we can learn from that are going to appeal on a broader level?
Definitely. I mean, we were just talking about can't different be the beauty in women's football?
Yeah.
And this is where women's football completely outshines the men. When it comes to inclusivity, diversity, women being out about their sexualities, women talking about issues within society that are affecting them and other marginalized people. For the men's game to be able to get to that space would be a blessing for everyone, because honestly, the men's game is an industry just like any other industry in the world, but it's very public. So all of the issues that we're having all around the world are just under a microscope in men's football. So whether it's racism, whether it's homophobia, whether it's pay disparity, you see it because it's on such a public front. And so what's really awesome about women's football is we have those things, but we're trying to change them. We're using our voices. We're investing in things that hopefully are going to change the status quo. And I think that if we use women's football as that model for men's football, I think the game will be better off, because it'll be more inclusive. It's the world's game, the most beautiful game for a reason, because you need yourself and a ball to play. It's the most accessible game in the world, and that's what makes it so beautiful. But unfortunately, because of politics, because of stereotypes, because of all these different things, a lot of people aren't able to play the game just because of who they are. And the women's game isn't about that. So if we're able to use the women's game as that beacon on a hill, then I think the game and the world would be much better off.
So I guess that leads me then to the next question. How do we take women's football from something that's watched once every 4 years to something that's watched every week?
So I do believe that showcasing the very best of women's football is essential, and almost build that audience, and there you can build a volume of coverage. So what we're trying to do this next year is focus on the big moments, like the international match this Saturday. That will be prime time on one of our main networks. We'll be doing the Women's FA Cup. We'll be taking more matches from that. We're going to look at the international and potentially some selected WSL games, although I have to stress those rights are with another broadcaster. So it's very much due to their generosity. And then, as I say, we've got the big international moments like the Olympics and then the Euros in 21. And so I would probably say quality, not quantity, but up the regularity.
I think that's a great note to end things on. That just leaves me to wrap things up, to say thank you to you guys, my expert panel. Some fascinating insights. Thank you to WebSummit for inviting us all along, and thank you to you guys for joining us.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.